Welcome to this week's CLM, our last regularly scheduled of the summer, except we will have a special edition next week for previewing an exercise of SD 551 with Professor Saeed. Online we have Sean and Christine joining us, and in the room we have Professor Oleg Petlov and Khalid Saeed. I'll be presenting today. This is the sort of, I presented a few times on this. This is the work that grew out of my quals that I did in April, and I presented a few times in the CLM, developing this radicalization. This is a poster that I want to take to the conference in Iceland next week. So really what I'm looking for today is feedback on the poster, the presentation, some of the elements in it to refine it. I want to turn it into the ATC on Monday and have them print it out and take it with me next Friday when I depart. So who's going to the conference? Oh, okay. So you'll get to see this again up close. And I've got it set, it's all set in one screen, but I can zoom in if need be on it. But really, yeah, the feedback is just almost more visual aesthetics. Does it make sense? Am I missing gaps? Anything like that, that as a poster you'd say, not just the research itself, but specifically for a poster, this, you could fix it here. Kind of walking through it first and then maybe go into details. It sort of is supposed to read sort of like a story a little bit. It starts with a debate of what causes radicalization, which is the two experts, Mark Sageman and Bruce Hoffman, back in 2008 began a debate on the primary cause of radicalization. One is called the swarm theory, which is that domestic conditions create localized, sort of unaffiliated radical individuals who then form small cells or do their own thing and conduct terrorism. And the response to that is not to go overseas and start military interventions, focus on domestic issues, local policing, community efforts, that sort of policy response. Hoffman, who was another counterterror expert, took exception to that and said, no, radicalization is a process that foreign terrorist organizations or domestic terrorist organizations use. They recruit, they radicalize, they broadcast, they send messages, and therefore the appropriate response is robust military and intelligence intervention abroad to disrupt the safe havens and conflict zones in which these organizations work. And of course, it's not purely an academic debate because you're talking about where do billions of dollars go, what's the US policy, how do you respond? And this debate has played out in a lot of areas. I'm interested in Sean's perspective. I've heard anecdotally that even if it's not named the Sageman-Hoffman debate, the question, in a lot of law enforcement is, do we look for groups or do we look for individuals or what do we look for? And so I don't think the debate's been resolved, and I'm going to attempt to resolve it. And they presented it as mutually exclusive theories. So these two disagreed strongly with each other. They said it's either one or the other. They, however, kind of agreed on the steps of radicalization. So those steps in the second box, the 9 steps are sort of, it's listed as a process, but it's actually much more of a web effect. It all sort of happens simultaneously. But you go through this concept of having a perceived grievance, outrage, moral outrage at the grievance as the grievance is occurring. You begin to adopt a narrative, which is sort of a world conspiracy of describing why the grievance exists, who's responsible for the outrage. That leads to fixation, where you just become fixated on your target group. You adopt what's called the warrior identity, this identification of the pseudo-commando, which is everything up to this point could lead to civil activism, it could lead to voter registration, it could lead to lots of things that are perfectly fine. But when people begin adopting the warrior mentality or the pseudo-commando, they begin saying, I need to strike on behalf of the people who can't, I need to do something, I need to fight the war, you sort of put themselves in a hero mindset. These people begin pooling together, there's local activation that leads to terroristic behavior, and that prompts a societal response which can contribute back in the grievance. So Sageman and Hoffman agreed largely, they may have used different words, but they agreed largely with that process. Where they disagreed is Sageman said it was the domestic conditions that generate these dynamics. And Hoffman was, no, it's the terrorist organizations that generate these dynamics. We did an empirical analysis, polled several 100,000 terrorist incidents in the US and Europe from 1995 to 2017, and then filtered it to the same kind of perpetrators that Sageman and Hoffman were talking about, which is Salafi, Takfiri, radical Islamic terrorists. There's 167 of those cases, and when you break them up into Western Europe and the US, we found that there was actually evidence for both theories. So in the Europe, most of the significant attacks, most of the most casualty attacks, most attacks in general are affiliated with some group. So that's evidence of the fisherman hypothesis. And you can see a behavior chart on the bottom there of terrorist attacks in Europe, and that big spike at the end is the rise of ISIS. This is going through 2017. The United States, however, was evidence of the swarm hypothesis. The majority of terrorist attacks were unaffiliated. They were lone wolves. They might have been inspired, but they were not directly affiliated with the group. And I kept the scale the same. So the US, you can see, is lower, but there is also an increase at the end corresponding with the rise of ISIS. It's not necessarily clear whether ISIS is causing that. It just happens to be the same time. So taking from the behavior modes, built a generic dynamic hypothesis that became inclusive of both authors' theories. So it's not depicted, but individually created CLDs for each author's theory and then combined them. And these two causal loop diagrams are capable of demonstrating a system which can manifest both swarm and fisherman behaviors. So the debate is not which one is right, it's that are they both right under different manifestations of a system, and what creates those contingent conditions, and what do you do as a policy response?
May I make one suggestion here? Maybe the poster is okay. It's probably for later. Mm-hmm. Your dynamic hypothesis and that feedback loop diagram which comes out of the model should be the same. So the level of aggregation should be the same in your initial dynamic hypothesis, and I think that's the module.
Yeah, this is the module down below.
So having two diagrams is confusing. Mm-hmm. So eventually, maybe you need to construct a level of aggregation.
Let's put it this way, is this even, I struggled with this because it kind of said, I built a model and here's a structure. But it's kind of showing, is this even helpful? Because I'm looking to remove stuff, clutter, create more white space, maybe increase the size of this. Is it worth just saying, we built a model and we did some experiments, or should I show the structure somewhere?
I think if this second diagram is similar to your dynamic hypothesis, that is saying that the feedback, your mental model, your feedback loops actually exist in the stock and flow structure. It's a valid phase validation. Mm-hmm. But if the two diagrams are different, it doesn't add anything.
Yeah, I struggle because this is the first time I use Stella. This is good tips.
So my suggestion would be maybe you can simplify the dynamic hypothesis maybe by aggregating some of the positive feedback loops. Or if you don't want to, the variable names in your dynamic hypothesis should be translated into equation clusters, stock and flow clusters underneath. So in the end, you actually recover that dynamic hypothesis from your stock and flow model. That's the intent.
Okay.
As it is, I'm a little bit confused as an observer.
Mm-hmm. So the first one doesn't have a model associated with it.
No.
He started out with this dynamic hypothesis. My suggestion is to maybe merge some of the feedback loops.
Is it important? One of the reasons that there's so many words on here is I wanted to tie, you could find each of these things in the theory somewhere. But to me, it's one positive feedback loop. I could call the whole thing radicalization, and it goes through these steps.
So what you can say is that this is what the theories say, and here is a more aggregate version which represents your dynamic hypothesis that takes that detail in the theories and merges some of the feedback loops together. So you create that dynamic hypothesis, and the variable names do not have to correspond to the model. These are the names of the modules. and then construct structure underneath each module. So when you are building the model, you don't have this feedback structure, you're just constructing the detail under each variable name. But when you, what you end up with is a set of relationships which are in the dynamic hypothesis.
Because in trying to keep the model simplified, a lot of these things are very highly aggregated structure. There's really not enough structure to put in. Like some of those modules, if you click on them, there's like 3 parameters. It's just very simplified.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. So if you want to keep this diagram, then your module relationships should return that diagram.
To the same level of complexity?
Same level. Or simplified, I would simplify. I would
The
say
top
that
model.
the top model, that here is the model of the theories. And then you can say that I further aggregate it.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the simplified version that you have created. And then construct a model with the modules using that version. So that simplified mental model, simplified aggregate dynamic hypothesis is sitting on top of the stock and flow diagram.
Have you ever seen a visual way of sort of tying, or maybe I just verbally, since I'm standing there, tying together, if I put a higher level term in there, I can point back and say, this term includes 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, yes.
Just probably verbally, not do colors or any symbols, keep it simple. Okay.
So if you can construct a, if you can tie this diagram to your module structure,
Yeah.
and if you don't want to make any changes.
Well, I think I'm going to follow your advice and it's sort of like from the theory, the CLD is a bridge to the model structure, but they should reflect one another or don't include the model, have one or the other.
Yeah.
If they're different, have one or the other. But if they're the same, it can show a bridging.
Yes.
Yeah, this is also my first attempt with modules, so this is really good feedback of how to use the modules and how do you replicate the CLD or the structure.
But I think like with the first CLD, it's also what's nice about it is that so maybe you should use it somehow, somewhere, right? Is that you actually developed it to show how 2 theories can be merged together, right?
I can probably keep that because I can show this is the fisherman theory and this is the swarm theory occupying the same space, but maybe cut out a lot of the words.
I think Oleg is right that you tie the 2 theories together, you map them in the detail which exists in the two views.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, there's too much detail out there. Actually, there is some duplication and it can be further aggregated, simplified to this diagram. And then construct a model which returns that second simplified diagram.
Yeah, because there's no paper being submitted alongside this with the poster, which is okay because I don't want to.
Yeah.
Can I suggest something like maybe I'm looking too much into it, but so in the top bubble you say we built a generic dynamic hypothesis, right? And then at the bottom you say we then develop generic structure to experiment. So generic. So maybe like just not call it generic, maybe just
I was trying to it's one of those models where it uses a lot of 1s and 0s as scalar functions. It says, it doesn't it's very aggregated.
So the first feedback map is really a feedback map of the theories.
Correct. So maybe the
theory.
It's not your dynamic hypothesis. Your dynamic hypothesis is more aggregate and simpler.
Right, exactly. That's a good one. So maybe like be specific that it's just basically a representation of the theories, generic dynamic hypothesis. So it's how would you say it's
not dynamic. Got it.
You're building a causal diagram or an influence diagram.
Yeah, it's an influence diagram.
Really? Influence diagram. Never heard that word before.
It is British.
Oh, what is it another word for CLD?
Yeah, I think they started calling it in
Absolutely.
influence diagrams.
I'm going uptown now.
Um,
Influence diagram of the theories.
yeah, something like that.
Okay. Yeah. So just take the dynamic hypothesis out of it.
Yes. And then there's your dynamic hypothesis, which is a simplified version.
And this is literally the dynamic hypothesis and generic structure
Right.
combined in one. Got it. Okay.
So, and you have that simplified feedback set of feedback loops as your dynamic hypothesis. Each variable in that feedback loop is your module.
Well, what I'm wondering is, can I just say, here I say we built a influence map of the theories, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Down here, we then,
represents.
We then
yeah,
developed
represents. Then we say, we then developed a dynamic hypothesis using modules. And then you keep this as the dynamic hypothesis.
Fine.
Because it's much more aggregated.
Yes.
Would I need to put in the notations of positive and negative feedback, or just leave it as it is?
Can you do it?
You can.
Ooh, you're right. I don't know if you can install it.
You can. You can.
You put in label. Yeah, you can probably put
Put a
text
label. You can put a feedback.
Okay.
But is each of those? Can you identify like positive and negative feedback loops in that structure? Or is it like
Yeah, this green one here is the same as this one.
Okay.
This purple outside, it's sort of color codes. We can kind of, so I can, and it works the same way in the model.
Yeah.
So let me just get this right. Building an influence diagram representing the theories, consolidated theories or something.
Yeah. Consolidated. Yeah.
And then below, build a dynamic hypothesis using modules and Stella. Or should I even say modules and
No,
Stella?
the dynamic hypothesis is a simplified structure based on the influence diagram.
So just say build a dynamic hypothesis based on the influence diagram.
So yeah, you're basically saying that here are the coupled positive and negative feedback loops which reside in those theories, which generate multiple manifestations. And then under each variable, you have a module, which
yeah, each one of these you could
structure.
click on and it would have structure.
Yeah.
Not much in some cases, but.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, then I wanted to know, I mean, from space purposes, it goes here, but I wanted to make sure. So now we have the dynamic hypothesis that represents.
And if I might digress a little bit from here.
Sure.
There have been a lot of things said of the problems with causal loop diagrams and how they cannot be tied to stock and flow model. And our friend George Richardson is even suggesting a hybrid diagram consisting of which will have stocks and also the influence arrows. I disagree with all that. I want to move away from all that. What I'm saying is that these two are different pieces. The dynamic hypothesis is a mental model which cannot be simulated. It's a more aggregate model. And it should not be tied to stock and flow structure. But the two are tied together by this dynamic hypothesis causal diagram sitting on top of that stock and flow structure. And actually, in early models of Forrester, and one of the earliest one is the corporate growth is influenced by capital investment, in which there is a sliding goal structure. If you look at how he clusters his equations and how he presents the three sectors of the system, the relationship between the sectors are his dynamic hypothesis. These are the feedback loops which generate that behavior. So he's saying that in each of these sectors, which is represented At that time, we had cluster of equations because there was no modules, there was dynamo only. There are no problems. Managers are making really boundary rational decisions. So there's a salesman sector, there is a production planning sector. And there's a
Well, didn't in his
structure.
principles of system structure, he also lay out a sort of, and I think I'm going from your cliff notes, there's sort of fundamental rules of how you develop these, and one of them was that sectors are almost self-contained around a unit of measure, and information goes between the sectors.
Yes, yes.
So the connection between sectors is usually information, not material flow. I mean, it could be material
So
flow.
what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, he had that view of feedback. He also said, I start with stocks. That's how I develop models, and that's what you do within each module, within each aggregate variable within each sector. And then the what he called the tissue which connects it together. I think that's the term that he used. Are feedback loops that drive the behavior of the system. So thinking in those terms, actually there is no anomaly, no confusion. Stock and flow representation is a computer-based representation.
Right.
And feedback loops are mental models. And if you perceive them at different levels of aggregation, there's no conflict. The conflict arises when you try to exactly map stock and flow structure into feedback loops.
I think that's, so what I've seen from practitioners, especially in the sort of military area, is an appreciation for causal loop that are very aggregate,
Yes.
very simplified. Don't worry about what stocks and flows, because for most people, that's the only way they're going to see and grasp the system. Because getting too into detail with structures and modules, that just over their head. But if, and this may be too much, even this, but they say simple couple loop archetype type things is how most people will grasp the important parts. And then everything else from that can be in the background to create the simulation.
But in your case, this diagram is important because here you are mapping the theories.
Yes.
You're showing that the influence relationships underlying the theories actually return this feedback structure. And you can say it's a bit too complex.
Mm-hmm.
And here is a simplified version.
Okay.
And that's your dynamic hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
Then you construct a model by constructing stock and flow structure under each variable in that dynamic.
And I've grown out of the need to show stock and flow anywhere on the poster because I don't know if that's super helpful with it. So.
Well, you might not be.
So, sort of where I was. Thank you. That was a good. It's always interesting hearing about these the different uses of the diagrams. And this being my first time using Stella in the modules, this is really good insight into the way to construct this. This now, so it's kind of, this is where we're sort of a radical left turn, no pun intended, in that we've talked about influence map representing the theories, we're talking about a dynamic hypothesis of the structure, but now, because of space purposes for the most part, I said, here's the state space design, right? Here's the visual that I'm going to cue you for the rest of the experiments, which shows that the state space consists of 4 quadrants, and it's, one is the percent of unaffiliated radicals. So at the top, you're 100% swarm, and at the bottom, you're 100% fisherman. So the y-axis is percent of radicals unaffiliated, and the bottom is percent of radicalization threat contributed by affiliated. So if 100% of threat comes from foreign terrorist organizations, you're down here. 100% comes from individuals on the internet just typing their own thing and inciting one another. That's over here. And you get these 4 boxes. Now, the 2 guys only came up with these 2, fishermen and swarm. So I'm trying to mentally think about what do these other 2 quadrants represent and come up with names for them. So if you think about it, a fisherman quadrant means that both the people committing the terrorist acts and the ones creating the threat are related to a terrorist organization. And I'd use an example here, like the Ku Klux Klan, right? That's a fisherman model. A swarm model is where everyone committing the terror and creating the threats are sort of online, unaffiliated movements, like the incel movement that was behind the Toronto mass shooting. Incel. It's a very niche group of angry sort of misogynistic men who sort of have ultra hatred to women, and they're sort of attributed. But it's not. There's no group. There's no organization. There's no like Al Qaeda. But it's a large movement that has now had several mass shooting attacks tied to it, to members of that group. Not. You could also say, like in the U.S., the terrorist attacks we have, even though they're done in the name of ISIS, there's no apparent affiliation. There's no, they're being inspired. But then you're left with these two spots, which is what happens when most of the people are not affiliated with a terrorist organization, but maybe inspired by them. And so that's where I came up with the name Inspired Swarm. This is a terrorist organization is now pumping out ideological and sort of motivational stuff, but it's not their members committing the acts, or it's people.
Before we go more, do you mind explaining like the axis?
Sure.
Like why did you pick that one? Why did you pick this one?
Well, I was trying to.
Different.
The difference is affiliation of the radicals themselves are they part of a terrorist organization?
Mm-hmm.
Threat is who is creating the radicalization momentum. Is it people in a terrorist organization who's kind of like it's their job, right? The terrorist organization gives them money, they're out there putting propaganda, they're creating websites. It's an organized effort that if you shut down the terrorist group, the threat goes away.
Okay.
Or is it people on chat rooms and internet forums who are not related to a terrorist group at all, just doing their own thing now, sharing videos, social media kind of stuff? I mean, social media is used by both, but the question is the person generating the content that's going to radicalize someone else themselves affiliated with a terrorist organization? Or are they being directed?
I think here you're adding value. The debate is dichotomous. One person says it's a swarm, other says fishing.
Right.
You are adding some more space to it.
Yeah.
You added two more.
You added two more,
Mm-hmm.
and that completes the state space. So I think it's very, very interesting, and maybe you should highlight that it's not a dichotomous phenomenon. So it's not either this or that.
Yeah.
It's a system which can create multiple manifestations, which is swarm, fisherman, and by the way, these two more.
So could you explain, for example, then the fisherman? Why is it fisherman in the lower left corner? So it's percentage of affiliated radicals is low, right? Because they all affiliated with something.
Right. So let's
allegiance.
One way to think of fishermen is remember the early days in Al Qaeda.
Yeah.
Everyone who did an attack was an Al Qaeda operative.
Yeah.
Al Qaeda was out there releasing videos, and we were sort of, it was the Al Qaeda threat. If we stop Al Qaeda, we end the threat. That's a fisherman space where the people are now. Think about ISIS. ISIS is sort of more.
Wait.
Go ahead.
But what I'm struggling with is the lower axis. Like, why is it like? So, what would be? What does it mean to be on the lower left?
Lower left means that
with respect to horizontal axis.
Oh, horizontal is that if you the people who are contributing to radicalization, that are radicalizing others,
yes,
are themselves connected to a terrorist organization.
So when you say affiliated radicals, it's members of some organization?
Yes, that probably should be clear, that affiliated
That's
means
low. So the local people who are affiliated with a movement are not many.
So
when you towards the left.
So the person who is a member of organization is not an affiliated person. He is a member of organization.
He is affiliated.
He's affiliated.
Yes.
So there are not many who are members of the organization. Towards the left of the axis.
No. If you're the vertical is the number of people who are affiliated. If you're low, more of them are affiliated. In fact, if you're at the bottom, all of them are affiliated. If you're at the top, none of them are affiliated.
So those are like lone wolves, right?
Exactly. Up here is lone wolves, but the threat itself can still come from either side. So lower left is the people who, the actual radicals are affiliated, and the radicalization itself comes from an organization. Upper right is that these are the loose guys, bunches of guys in network that are just sort of casually doing it. that aren't connected by an Al Qaeda or KKK or something.
So I think like I'm having difficulties with the lower, like the horizontal one. So once again, so like left axis, like left end of the axis.
Right. So if you could look at 100 tweets,
okay,
right, and say who wrote these tweets,
okay,
and 100 of them were written by people that you could say they're sitting in rooms for ISIS. ISIS is paying their payroll, providing the servers. You'd be at the left here.
Tim, that's the detail. I think what Olin is pointing out is that it's sort of a basic thing. The scale should increase from 0 to high,
right,
as you go towards the right, or you go up.
right.
Well,
So maybe some of these quadrants will change.
that was the problem in that I spent a lot of time where can you place a box where, because this value is 0 to 1, and this value is 1 to 0, or it's a negative 1 to 0 to 1.
That's okay. Can that other value also be on a similar scale? No.
I struggled with it because you're basically, the measure of this is you take the total number of radicals and you subtract out the ones who are affiliated. So you get a 0 to 1, right? 1 means 100% are unaffiliated. 0 means.
How about changing it to affiliated? 0% affiliated to 100% affiliated.
Right. So if we change this, so if we did 100% affiliated at the top,
Fisherman will be
and 100% affiliated
at the bottom.
threat,
Yeah.
then the radicalization, we'd have to reverse this.
Yes.
So that the fisherman would be in the upper right.
Yes.
Okay, so that both of them are basically expanding out from this point,
Yes.
up here, up that way.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe this was close to my confusion.
Yeah, I struggled with this for about a week trying to find the right way to map these and get them both, because I was having some, but I'll see if I can monkey with the formula.
And I'm sorry this causes like that will possibly cause like need to change for some.
Well, I mean, I'd rerun the experiments, and it would, instead of this one going this way, it would come down here.
Right.
But it'd still be in the right space, the correct space. Yeah, because the purpose of this is to say, if you're in this space, here's a set of policies you can take. This is the nature of the threat you're facing, so here's some suggestions of how to deal with it.
So how would it be, like, just, I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah.
going back. So how would it be then if you modify the horizontal one? So we're just going to
It would be, this would be 0 to 100% is the percent of radicalization threat contributed by affiliated radicals.
And that the Y scale will be
Number of affiliated radicals
number of
total of all,
Yes.
as a percentage of the overall population.
And these quadrants will
Reverse.
Yeah.
Mirror, they should. Mirror reverse. This is something that just, it may just be that I'm not good at spatial puzzles, but I had to go on my whiteboard and sit there.
It's difficult. It's not
Yeah.
easy. You have to find an index
Yeah.
which is very descriptive on the state space.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy problem.
Yeah, so that's a while.
Yeah, we struggled with it a lot.
Do you think people get what affiliated means? Like, is somebody who claims allegiance to something, is he affiliated or he's not affiliated?
So this comes from, and this is, I'm open to words. The actual empirical data, the group that tracks this, University of Maryland, they say they have a measure and a method of saying affiliated or not affiliated. So they've tracked every single terrorist incident, and they kind of give an objective. So even if someone says, hey, I'm with ISIS, and according to their rules, it just claimed it on Facebook, they'll say unaffiliated. But if you received money or training or contact, you know, they can establish something. And so I'm trying to stay close to that word, but affiliated and unaffiliated is kind of a mouthful. You know, sort of like member would be a better word, but they don't use that.
I mean, I think as long as you explain it somewhere in the paper, like.
Oh yeah, the paper explains it. This is using their definition of affiliated, in which case it's not me saying it, it's them saying it. It's people put together the data source. So it's, the model is set. So I'll try and see if I can figure this out and do a reversing mirror image here. So all of these will now be reversed, but the same concept holds. I don't know if this is beneficial. Model set to equilibrium. So it shows a state space with a dot in the middle because it's perfectly balanced to start, where you have equal number of terrorist organization radicals, equal number of unaffiliated, your threats coming from both. and you have a set line in equilibrium that doesn't change. It just shows that the model runs in equilibrium.
Maybe you don't need it in the poster, but that's a good point of reference for your analysis.
So maybe put like as a bullet, the model runs in equilibrium, but don't take up space with it. Okay. Because I'm trying to figure out what I can take out and is superfluous.
And so maybe if you take out the bubbles, so maybe you can like actually enlarge.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking is play around with the real estate. Runs in equilibrium, but don't show bubbles. Okay. And then I show some sample experiments, which are really kind of cases of different. So the disturbances you can do is you can use a significant or catastrophic terrorist event. A significant is 100 people get killed. A catastrophic is 1,000. It breaks the norm. It's a disturbance event. It's a one-time, one-off. And then the policy responses you choose from there drive the behavior of the system. And you can choose to allocate your resources entirely foreign, entirely domestic, somewhere in between. And the perceived credibility of the response is also variable. So these are the three things you can vary. Oh, you can also vary the starting level. So if you wanted to start someone and say, we're going to start in the fisherman space, you could say there's 2,000 radicals in the terrorist organization and only 1,000 here. It will start not in equilibrium in the state space, it'll start down here so you can show. And from that, I just pulled some experiments, which then I sort of, Asmert from Sandia gave the advice of sort of saying, pick some iconic names, and I don't know if I've done that, but sort of pick cases that are illustrative of things. So this is one that shows, it's a little bit hidden by these, there you go. A little hard to see. What it shows is that the organized terrorist organization declines a lot because you have a large focus on eliminating them, but the credibility of that elimination is low, and you actually have more domestic radicals. And what this is the case of the US anti-government movement in the 1990s after Ruby Ridge and Waco. They went after these sort of militia groups very hard, but the perception was, well, you killed a lot of civilians in doing that. There was sort of a backlash about and concerns. So what they ended up doing is driving people into the swarm space. The French ISIS spiral is sort of the example of a country that is, from a foreign affairs standpoint, very limited. France has airstrikes in Syria. They're fairly surgical. They're not invading a country, but they are confronting ISIS. But domestically, they have soldiers on the street. They have checkpoints. They're doing warrantless searches. They've got this emergency measures. And it shows this kind of spiraling into the fisherman space, which actually corresponds with the behavior we see in Europe. So it's sort of like the European case. High foreign credibility, but low domestic credibility. Boiling the frog, this was the most interesting one because I was like struggling. How do you get it in the inspired swarm space? And what it is in this case, there's a conflict zone in the model where the terrorist organization can be in. Normally, it's the country responding creates the conflict. So like we went into Afghanistan, that created a conflict which created a feedback loop of generating more activity. But in the Syrian case, some third parties creating conflict. We're not creating it. Bashar Assad and the civil war, these things outside our control are creating the conditions which generate grievance, and we're not able to just turn them off because we aren't like an intervening party to the extent where we can say we're going to stop the Syrian civil war or not. And there's also no, when that is the case, and there doesn't even need to be a big terrorist attack, you still have dynamics emerge because someone else is propelling this conflict. And what it does is it drains the people out of the local as they go abroad to support this movement. And they're getting killed over there, but they're going to eventually come back. So it's kind of like a boiling the frog. There's no dramatic one attack that indicates the risk, like says, oh, 9/11, this is bad. It's because people are heading over, they're inspired by this global conflict that they see on the news, they're going over, they're radicalizing, and they're coming back. And then the other one is the 9/11 response, which is, this one is just to show it started in fishermen, it didn't start in equilibrium, I started heavy in fishermen, it had a catastrophic attack, which in the model propels the response. There's sort of a magnitude of response is equal to the discrepancy between what I expect from normal terrorist casualties and what it is. So when 9/11 happens, there's this huge discrepancy. We do a massive foreign response, and what we get is this, it's hard to see in the red.
Actually, George Bush used a term to sort of amplify the response.
What was it?
Shock and awe.
Shock and awe. You could call this a shock and awe because it shows you wipe out the foreign terrorist organization very quickly because you're putting all your military pressure.
I mean, if you're looking for a name, that's
Shock and
the
awe.
one which was used. Shock and awe.
That was in Iraq, though, wasn't it?
That was in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan too. Okay.
No, that was in Afghanistan. The first bombing.
Yeah, it was shock and awe. Okay.
Shock and awe.
I know it got. So this shows that you started out with say Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, and you completely eliminated them, but because of the way you did it, you drove a huge shift, a state shift from fishermen to swarm. And this is actually a classic problem in counterterrorism. Is they use the term disaggregation to say, take an Al Qaeda group, break all the links, break all the networks, break all the stuff so that they're just individual small groups and countries, and you end up with this.
So you can call it shock and awe, and within parentheses, 9/11 response. Like in the previous case, you're boiling the frog, Syrian.
Well, I'm trying to think of iconic names for this U.S. anti-government. Like, I don't know, is Ruby Ridge and Waco even mean anything to people who aren't in the U.S.?
You may not.
Yeah, I don't even know if it means anything to people. Christine, does it mean anything to you when I say Ruby Ridge or Waco? Is that too old? I'm sure, Sean, you probably heard of those.
Yeah, but I just don't think I would associate those two events with what you're addressing. I just kind of view.
Yeah, it's sort of the anti-government response afterwards, the Ruby Ridge and Waco. I'm trying to think of those were years ago, yeah. So this is something where the anti-government movements, there aren't many organized, truly organized terrorist anti-government movements around, but there's a whole lot of radicalized, potentially dangerous individuals that are anti-government. They've learned not to. I mean, you could also use this for the white power example, like the KKK and the Aryan Nation were sort of eliminated as organizations, but they still exist.
Movements in the British colonies.
There were what?
British anti-government movements in the British colonies. To some extent, the freedom movement in the United States was like an anti-government movement against the colonial regime. So, I mean, I cannot think of an example from present day,
right?
But historically, against the colonization, there have been such movements in India, Africa.
Did they target the organizations and people ended up sort of mass organizing without a specific, like, targetable organization sort of become a swarm?
Like Gandhi's movement was, what was it called? Civil disobedience movement. Gandhi's movement was civil disobedience movement. There was the dumping of tea here in Boston Harbor, which
and that was a case where there was no terror, sort of radical group you could identify that says this is us. We took. I mean, the Sons of Liberty were sort of the terrorist group at the time. They were the radical group at the time, but I don't think the Tea Party would be an example of a swarm. Group of guys get together and do something as opposed to being organized by.
But were there any similar acts elsewhere?
Oh, there was a lot of radical. I mean, I've made comparisons between Sam Adams and CLM.
Was this movement called this was liberation?
Yeah, they're the only group that is sort of like, there's this group, Sons of Liberty, that went around and did a lot of stuff, but for the most part, it was mobs, riots. It wasn't tied to a specific organization that had a specific agenda. It was much more of what you would call a swarm behavior, where people are self-organizing themselves rather than getting together and having until the course of the revolution.
Gandhi's movement in India?
Because Gandhi's movement was that, I mean, that wasn't tied to a political party or, I mean, something came out of it, but originally it was self-organizing, wasn't it?
He was basically saying that we need rights of self-determination and end of discrimination. And the common element was civil disobedience.
And I want to make sure on this case.
Peaceful civil disobedience.
Exactly. I was like, these are violent radicals as opposed to non-violent. Like, you could have non-violent radicals and have civil disobedience and civil protests and things like that.
But I think the flavor is the same. It was just Gandhi that he said it should be non-violent, but elsewhere, like in Africa, there have been violent movements against colonialism. So, I mean, the examples are out there in history.
The conclusion, I'm not sure in a poster how you do a conclusion. It always seems like you're standing there talking to them, so it's sort of like you could put in more words, but theories are manifestations of the same system resolving the debate. Policies must recognize current state of system and provide credible response to avoid fixes that fail. In the paper, I'm actually going to get a lot more up to, okay, you're an inspired swarm. What policies should you take? What should you actually do? But in this one, I'm sort of just keeping it high level and saying it's a generic structure applies to other types of radicalization, not just Salifi theory, but white power, ultranationalism, maybe even online bullying, like Gamergate and Sad Puppies is this online swarm activity where harassing, online bullying, terroristic behavior, stalking, threats, all that stuff comes with no apparent organized entity behind it. Mass shooters might also go through some of this, where they're following through on the radicalization, and they would, you know, they're sort of lone wolf actors up here. But I mean, what is the purpose of a conclusion on the poster? Is that about the high points?
No, I think the conclusions are fine.
Sean and Christine, any feedback after being walked through? I know this is the first time seeing it, Sean, so it's. But
yeah, I just have a question as a process. So you'll be given what, a half an hour or an hour to go through this?
No, the reason I did a poster is you sit for 2 or 3 hours and people come up and you talk for as long as you want.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't like the panel format where you have 15 minutes to include questions and a couple slides. This is going to be something I'm standing next to in a big banquet hall where people
gotcha.
sit around and sort of have much more in-depth conversations.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough thing to kind of encapsulate in just a brief conversation. Which I think you do a pretty good job. That's why I'm curious, because this is obviously, it could be a 6-hour discussion, but from that limited perspective, I think you captured the essence of what you're trying to do.
Is this obviously not in its current state, but along the path of what might be useful, you think, for when we talked about law enforcement?
Yeah, and you know, I would probably have to look at it again, because it'd have to be just broken down into kind of what the problem is, what the possible solution are, and how you would operational. Kind of what I'm looking at, that, you know, you can look at it from very conceptual terms, which a lot of people won't be interested in more in operational terms. So, yeah, I just think, you know, probably their interest would be more on the back end on what policies they can implement.
Yeah, I think coming from the academic literature, there'd be a translation of, instead of all causal loop, it'd be like, if you're here, do this. You know, here are signs where you're at, and this is what you should do in response. Kind of how do you know where you are? What should you do in response, and does it work?
So very operational.
Yeah, but base it off something in the academic literature that's had the, you know, the peer review and stuff like that.
Yep, that's kind of a tough thing to do at the same time. But
well, I'll probably do the academic article first, but my intention in all this is to get tools out to people. So try and get published first, and then create the translation afterwards. This also ties in. I didn't go into it. It's not in the poster, but it actually. Have you ever heard of Trap 18?
I haven't. No.
It's a mass shooter risk assessment, and it's part of the FBI's Pathway to Violence studies, where they have 18 indicators that indicate someone. This actually lays on top of that, so
okay.
It can follow in with what the FBI is using as terminology for you can find the 18 characteristics in there without, they're not explicitly called out, but in the paper I can show a crosswalk to say.
Maybe in the conclusion.
Yeah.
Conclusion,
This,
and there'll be sort of suggestions for further research.
That's good. I was wondering what else would be a suggestion. Should I put in there that I'm estimated dissertation date or anything like that? Because I am kind of advertising in the market a little bit, or should that just be a verbal?
Yeah, verbal.
Okay, because suggestions for research. Dissertation. Any text that is superfluous, like I was wondering if I could, if I had the debate what causes radicalization, just remove this paragraph and do that as a voiceover and just have the table which shows the summary. I mean, I'm trying to find ways to remove words. It feels kind of wordy, or is it okay? Oh, okay. I never know. You've seen my papers. Don't worry.
Those are long. This is awesome.
Okay. I must have some, move contact info to the top right, you have more space. White boxes, more uniform width for each 3 columns and boxes. Too much bold for me, I don't know where to focus. Examples, Fisher swarming boxes. Okay, Christine, thank you. Good stuff. I'm never sure if I can put contact information up here in this or whether this is like privileged space and you have to protect it.
Yeah, you should put contact information.
Up there?
Yeah.
So move contact up top.
I was also suggesting to use this feature also used as a second core.
I think last is that's what we found out in engineering. The last author is your advisor or something.
In terms of contribution.
Yeah, so last is fine. That's what the convention.
Do you want to be third?
I think college should have second, but like, you guys debated that.
I'll defer to. If anyone asks you, say it's just very complicated.
There was some algorithm.
All right. Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you for all.
So actually, I found out that in engineering and sciences, the first and last author are the main contributors.
I've heard something like that in medical studies too.
In medical studies.
But in medical, because there's usually like 17 people, it's the first and the last, and then like the second, third, and fourth have specific roles, and then the rest is just in the middle.
Okay. So first,
all right, thank you everyone for your participation. We'll put this up on YouTube, it's recorded. And again, we are having a meeting next week. We were not gonna have one, but we are gonna have one to go over the SD 551 revised exercise. We'll have a note coming out against that. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording. Thanks everyone.